everyone. Welcome to today's Knowledge at Noon, and thank you for joining us. Today's Knowledge at Noon event is called Introducing and Building a Culture of Evaluation for Program Development. Today, I'm joined with my guest here, Dr. Kristen Hodge Clark here. Dr. Hodge Clark is a member here at the School of Continuing Studies. She serves as the Senior Assistant Dean for Program Planning within here at the School of Continuing Studies. Dr. Hodge Clark is also an adjunct instructor who teaches courses for the same Certificate in Education Program Evaluation. So thank you so much for joining today, Dr. Hodge Clark, and I want to just get right into it, hand it over to you, and then we'll start today's Knowledge at Noon. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And it's a pleasure to see everyone here today. I'm delighted to talk about this topic. I like to joke and say I'm a lifelong evaluator. Among all of the different things that I've done throughout my career, virtually, I think every role I've had has involved evaluation in some form or fashion or research. From leading large conferences and thinking strategically about how are we evaluating these annual meetings year over year, to working with a local area school district and helping to build substantive evaluations for their various programs, summer programs, and all the way to my current role in which I oversee what we call our external review process for our existing degree programs, which includes a huge evaluative component just to measure the success and effectiveness of those programs. So evaluation really does kind of come in a lot of different forms and fashions. And so I'm delighted to be here. Give me just a moment. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start to dig into what we're going to cover today. All right. Well, as Jonathan's already mentioned, and as you all have seen in registering for this session, today's topic really is about how do you introduce and build a culture of evaluation, either in your organization or within your specific role. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those various areas. We'll discuss the importance and process of program development, of evaluation and program development. The structure today for our session is focused on starting with what I like to call the 5 W's of evaluation: the who, what, why, when, where, and of course the how. I'm going to outline a few of the key steps, and then I'll talk a bit about the types of evaluation. I'm not going to give you the exhaustive list of models, but I'm going to talk about some of the most common that we find in program evaluation. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about ethics and where does that fall into play. Throughout, I'm going to try to introduce a number of just real-life examples, real-world examples from my or other colleagues' experiences to help with the application and understanding of such. And so my hope is that this will be interactive and insightful for each of you. And as Jonathan mentioned, we'll take questions at the end. And so that's to me the most exciting part of this process, is that I love to get to know you all through those questions. So before we do that, I want to see who's in the room. So I'm going to do a quick poll just to see all of you all's various backgrounds and your experience with evaluation. So give me one moment while I pull up our first poll. All right, this first question is, are you currently using evaluation in your programs? Okay, I think we've got most of you and a few more trickling in. Okay, let's see where we landed. All right, so it appears that we're kind of split. It looks to be that a good number of you, about 40%, say yes, And of course, I include it somewhat because, right, there are those of us who are kind of teetering on the edge of we're somewhat using evaluation, but maybe not in a formal way. A few of you who aren't using it at all, and perhaps a few of you for whom this isn't quite applicable right now in this moment. So that's incredibly helpful. I wanna run one more poll. Okay, and in this next poll, I'd be remiss as an evaluator if I wasn't actively evaluating my work, my sessions in this moment. So I want to understand kind of how you would rate your knowledge of program evaluation, and then we'll revisit this again at the end. Okay, I think I have almost a few more. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Okay, let's see where we're at with this one. All right. Okay. Looks like nearly half of you are somewhat familiar with the topic. Again, a good handful who have kind of more substantive knowledge, and a few who have no familiarity or knowledge of this topic. And so it's helpful for me to just see here where you all are at, see the spread, and who's in the room in different ways. And so my hope is that even as we get to the end of this session, I often say I love kind of this reciprocal learning environment. And so I welcome as we enter the Q&A later, that for those of you who do have experience, that you share some examples or if you have some anecdotes that may be relevant for your colleagues here on the call. So excellent, excellent. Well, what a delight. Okay, so I'm going to move forward and talk a little bit more just regarding a number of key factors with evaluation. My mantra is always that evaluation should not be an afterthought. It's got to be an intentional, meaningful, and essential ingredient in your program design. So even as you're thinking of these amazing programs or workshops or conferences or degrees or whatever it may be, at those early phases of planning, you should absolutely be thinking about how are we going to measure the effectiveness of this program. And even if you haven't done that, it doesn't mean that it's too late for you to start thinking and planning in this way. So I want to start with a key definition just to ensure that we're all on the same page about what exactly is evaluation. So it really is a systematic process, right? Where we're looking at and examining a program's operations, understanding the effects, and as appropriate for certain programs, the social implications of such. It really does allow us to dictate and determine how effective our programs are, and whether or not our organizations are seeing the intended outcomes that have been outlined for those programs. One of the things that I always like to share when I consider program design is that often, and I find this on the back end of evaluation, there aren't always agreed upon desired outcomes, especially if you have a program, let's say, that's been in existence for quite a while, and maybe the origins and why or how are not always known. I find sometimes that you have these conflicting views that emerge among stakeholders, like, well, this was our key goal for this was our key objective. And so, as part of this process, one of the ways that you can also sort of reach consensus is through different exercises, logic models, and the like, which I won't dig into today. But I think it's important to really stress, even at this phase, you may find that you have an organization who doesn't have clear outcomes in terms of or objectives around what that program was intended to do or provide. So how do you start to introduce this in your work? What are some of those initial key questions that you want to ask? So the obvious one, how effective are our programs, right? Are we measuring impact, and how are we doing so? When was the last time we actually evaluated this program? Have we ever evaluated this program in its history? Are we meeting its intended purposes? And again, that may or may not be clear, just depending on how clearly articulated the program's objectives are. What do the program participants think? Have we gathered their thoughts and views on how well or not they're receiving this particular program? Is the program worth the investment? This is the big question of ROI. Are we seeing the investment really materialize in the ways that we expected? If you can't answer those questions, this is why evaluation matters, right? This is why these are the sorts of things that you can take to your colleagues, your peers, and others to stress and emphasize the value and the necessity of evaluation. So I always like to think about the 5 W's of evaluation. The first being who's requested this evaluation, who is the target audience for the evaluation, who should be involved in this process. There's so much that can be unpacked from that, right? When we think about even the target audience, many of our programs may serve all sorts of different constituents or consumers in different ways. And it's the question around, do I want to engage this segment of the group? Do I want to engage the entire segment? Or maybe I want to actually engage those who have a role in executing the program. And we'll talk about those different types of evaluation, those that look at the actual process of execution of a program and those that are looking at the actual outcomes. The next big question is what type of evaluation is needed? And again, like I said, in just a little bit, we'll talk about the different and most common types of evaluation that you can leverage. When is the evaluation needed? So this is a big one, right? And here's why. The timing of evaluation matters. Particularly if for those of us who work in academic spaces, we're often operating on an academic calendar of some sort. And so there's sensitivities to when is the appropriate time to evaluate. Do we want to be mindful of when are the busiest times of year? When are the times when things start to slow down and people are less engaged? And so timing is everything. It's a big piece that you absolutely really want to give some really clear thought to as you think about when it is that you want to conduct the evaluation. The big question again, which we introduced with here, is why are we conducting this evaluation? Again, as I mentioned, to me, it's an essential part of any program. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be motivated or driven by, some outside player. To me, there's value in just saying, hey, we want to know just how we're performing. But you may find that one of the reasons, particularly if you have funding from external sources, it may be that the foundation who is supporting this wants to know how is this program performing. If there's government funding, a lot of government programs do require and build in an evaluative process. And so really thinking about the why, it will be certainly unique to your own context. But I think it's one, again, that to me, whether or not it's driven by external forces or not, you should absolutely be articulating why you're doing this work. And then lastly, the how. How are we going to do this? What are the things that we want to do? Do we have the right internal capacity to execute this? And again, we'll talk a little bit more later on about some of those key steps. I'm giving you all a really high level, but enough to understand about the process in today's session. And I love always starting with this idea to the right about you don't want to approach this process using tunnel vision at all. In part because you'll come to realize the more you engage, the more you see, the more the blind spots appear. And oh, wow, I never realized how much was happening here. And so I always love to say there's a whole story, right, that may be on the outside of this tunnel. And so unless we actually kind of keep an open mind in that way, we may miss some key elements of what may be happening within our particular programs. So among the key steps that you'll engage in an evaluation, and these are, again, the high-level steps that you want to think about. First, and this one is critical, and I can't stress this enough, conducting a needs assessment. And so if you're looking to evaluate a program that you're a part of, or if you're looking to engage in sort of external evaluation, you absolutely need to gather the right folks in the room and really get on the same page about, what is it that we're hoping to do with this evaluation? Why are we doing this evaluation? What are the things that we want to measure? And from there, once there is a clear understanding of what are those core areas, you can actually start to then build your key objectives and your key evaluation questions. Those key evaluation questions you'll go back to often because you're going to map your work always back to that phase. And then from there, once we've articulated what our evaluation questions are, that will dictate the type of evaluation. And again, we'll talk about the various forms and what that means, but the different types of evaluation can lend themselves to being better suited for some questions versus others. Methodology, qualitative and quantitative. I won't dig into that today, but know that methodology is also going to be dictated in part back to your key questions. Again, the nature of the questions that you're asking will certainly inform what's the best method that we should use in order to answer that question. And then, of course, data collection and analysis. And one final piece that I didn't add here, but I do think it is important and worth mentioning, is the reporting. How are we going to report this information out? Are we looking at producing a report that will be strictly for our own internal use? Or is this an external report that will go up to, either an external funder, to our constituents in different ways, consumers, and the like? So the who should be involved question related to all of this is about stakeholder engagement. A couple of things that I always like to think about. Among the program staff, you want to be strategic around who should be invited to participate in this planning process. Maybe that you have a large team, or maybe perhaps a small team, but you want to be thoughtful in terms of identifying who's best suited to participate. But certainly giving an opportunity for others to weigh in at different points in the process to secure the buy-in, and hopefully to not create a contentious process. The other group is, to some extent, if you're in an organization, nonprofit, or if you're in a corporate space, talking to and engaging leadership as appropriate around what they would like to see in this evaluation. It doesn't mean that they have to be obviously steeped in the granular details of the execution, but certainly getting their perspective is valuable. And I'm always of the thought that where possible, I always want to try to engage at least 1 to 2 program participants as well, just to hear from them about what they think would be meaningful in terms of an evaluation. And then finally, an evaluator. And so you may be wondering, well, that's why we're here. Maybe we don't have an evaluator otherwise. In some cases, you may in fact have someone who is an evaluator. And so in that early phase of even the program planning, it's valuable to think about engaging that individual. And I want to take a moment just for just a quick detour to talk a little bit about an experience that I had many, many years ago in my career, and why it matters to think about engaging an evaluator. And so a while back, I worked with a local school district to evaluate their summer school programs. And it was one of the most incredible learning experiences of my career. There were a lot of factors that were necessary for evaluation that just weren't considered at the outset. One of the biggest challenges that I faced were the assessments that were used. And this was a program that was evaluating math and reading programs. What I found was that the assessments that the initial curricular team had put together and other stakeholders were not quite as rigorous or standardized as I needed as an evaluator in order to decisively indicate, whether or not they had achieved their desired outcomes. They were using, if you know, and this may date myself for those of us, because my children, my sons don't use traditional textbooks anymore, and everything is virtual in this way. But if you remember textbooks having end of chapter quizzes, so they were using those sorts of assessments for the summer school program. And for me, the challenge again was that some of them were as rigorous as they needed to be. In the more elementary school programs, they had different fluency tests where the teacher was actually administering and asking a student, for example, to read a particular area and not allowing them to actually navigate it on their own. And so even the scales for those assessments were incredibly challenging in order to make some, clear, decisive comments on how well or not the program performed. And so lots of limitations I had to include in those final reports. And so my recommendation from that experience was always that to the extent that they could, include an evaluator from the evaluation team at the early planning phases, because we can offer thoughts on what are the sorts of assessments that will work best that will allow us to be able to tell the right story for the program. And so even if you don't have an internal evaluator or team or otherwise, I do think it's worth engaging someone who has a research perspective and can add value in that particular way for your programs. So I wanted to share, just thinking and digging in a little bit more to this idea of that first step in the process with conducting a needs assessment. Wanted to talk about a few of the sample questions that I traditionally use when I'm, starting this evaluation process. So one of the most obvious is what do we actually want to learn from this evaluation and how are we going to use the information? That's a big one. Are we intending to use this to create a rationale for why this program should continue to be funded? Are we hoping to scale this program? Are we hoping to determine if it should be sunset? All sorts of things come in and I think are packed into this idea of how will the information be used. Again, who's asked for this evaluation and who should be involved in the planning. And this is helpful whether you're internal or external, but for me, in my experiences, especially coming in as an external evaluator and not knowing who all may be a part of the organization in different ways, it's very valuable for me to have an understanding of the different roles that exist within the corporation, the organization, the university, whatever setting it may be. Will there be additional programs developed based on the findings? So this goes back to the question of scale. Are they hoping to scale this program in different ways? And that's and one of the reasons why they're initiating this. How much time is available? This one is huge. It's beyond measure. Are they giving you a very small, quick turnaround, finite time frame to produce a meaningful evaluation? Or are they saying, hey, you dictate the timeline? I've been in both scenarios, and I can tell you whether it's an unreasonable timeline to produce something within a matter of weeks, or it's so open-ended that the priority of what to do gets lost in the process. It can be a challenge. And so understanding what their expectations are is really incredibly important at that early initial step. I will say for you all as the evaluators, this is also the point where you can make recommendations. You can say, especially if there's a timeline that just seems not to fit with what their expectations are in terms of what they want to see produced. You can certainly advise them that, well, I think we may not be able to do all of that in 3 weeks, but maybe we can get one survey up, right? Or, okay, you want 2 to 3 years to do this work. Sure. But let's make sure that we are outlining in as robust of a way as we can all of the sorts of areas that we can dig into at this point. And so again, I can't stress this enough. Don't give this question short shrift in terms of your planning and your conversations with all of the key stakeholders. The last question is also a big one, and one that I've seen can cause a number of challenges or opportunities in your process. What financial resources are available? That's short and sweet. What's the budget? Do you have a budget for this evaluation? This will again be a point in which you can make recommendations as you start to build your evaluation proposal on what you can and can't do purely based off of budget, right? You start to make trade-offs and saying that, well, if you've got a fairly small budget or maybe no budget at all, what we can do is, again, maybe we start with just a survey and further along in the future, when additional resources are available, we can extend this quite a bit. So don't shy away from that question. You may not want to do it in the first conversation, but I would say by the second conversation, once you start to understand more around what it is they want, make sure that the conversation around financial resources is raised. Because unfortunately, and I've had an experience again in my career where my colleague and I were working with a local high school actually that wanted to evaluate this incredible program that they had recently launched, and it was a multi-year long program. And we outlined, and again, it's multi-year, so the expectation is that this evaluation will run over the course of several years. And so we thoughtfully crafted a proposal that had a pretty meaningful price tag in terms of being able to execute it well. And they, completely, as the young folks say, ghosted us. I imagine that they were like, "Whoa, this is way too much. We didn't expect it was going to cost this, right?" And so again, it helps to understand. And I don't think they had a budget in that particular instance, but they weren't forthcoming in sharing that. And so, as difficult as conversations about money are in any context, don't shy away from it, and also be willing to make some concessions and say, hey, we can take this off, add this on, or whatever, in whatever manner. So what do you do though when the stakeholders are completely at odds, when there's significant conflict on what should be the result of this evaluation? I want you all to think for a moment about what you would do in this scenario. And when we come to the end, I would love to hear from some of you, particularly again, those of you who have worked in evaluation. What do you do in those moments where you have these sorts of conflicts? And they may be among stakeholders, but quite honestly, it might be even with you as the evaluator, where you're recommending something and they're, resistant to your own expertise and what you're offering. And so a couple of things that you can do, and these are just a couple of options. This isn't exhaustive in any way. But one, I find it valuable in collecting data from different perspectives. So if we realize that not everyone is on the same page, I'll take some special time to have individual conversations with people and really dig into what it is they want from this experience. And then be able to kind of come back together and again start to offer some options in terms of, well, here's what we may do that we think could address each person's particular desires. And with that, you can offer compromises that take into account the time frame, the budget, and the like in various ways. So another real life example from my career where this was a moment where there was a bit of a conflict around what we as evaluators were proposing and suggesting as opposed to what this corporate client wanted. This was a custom leadership program for a corporation, and it was a pretty interesting experience in a lot of different ways. But as the program was being designed and we were starting to think about the evaluation, it was very clear that they wanted very much so to be very deeply involved in the weeds of the process and the planning in so many ways. In part because they were making a significant investment, so it was fair, right, to want to ensure that things were being done a particular way. But where we reached a difficult point is that they wanted to see individually, once the program was launched, how each member of their workforce was performing in this leadership training program. And so they wanted to see who was actually showing up for the sessions. They wanted attendance records. They were in the weeds, y'all. They were deep in the weeds. And so naturally, as evaluators, we were like, well, this is complicated. So what we ultimately had to do is two things, and we had a leg to stand on in part because this was connected to the university and other areas. For those of you who know, like FERPA, naturally there are certain protections for sharing individual student record data. And so we were able to share that, but also propose that we'll share an aggregate form, maybe by cohort, how participants are engaging in the program. We're able to let them know, what proportion of the cohort was responding to these weekly surveys they wanted us to execute. And so we were able to find some different ways to connect with them in that regard. So you'll find, again, once you work with multiple different teams and others, that there may be all sorts of ways in which conflicts present themselves. So now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the different types of evaluation. And forgive my cough, y'all. It is that time of year, and in my house, the flu has come through and through all the way. And so I think I'm dealing with some of the residuals from my 8-year-old. So thank you all for being patient with my cough. So there's three really common types of evaluation, and again, this isn't an exhaustive list. There's a few others that are used in program evaluation. These are the ones that I frequently use when I'm evaluating different programs. So the first is formative evaluation, or process evaluation is the other term that's used. This is really the type of evaluation where you're looking at digging into how well or not the program is being executed, right? So we want to understand if we said that we were going to provide computer labs at each of the designated school sites, are those computer labs there? Do we actually have computers in those labs? And so you're looking at, really the process component of the program. And you're looking to understand whether it's procedures or activities, and frankly, even, who's staffing the program. If we said that we were going to have trained counselors in this program, do we actually have qualified trained counselors in this program supporting whoever, whatever it may be? And so I appreciate formative evaluation because it does give you an opportunity to look at, the specifics around how or not the program is being executed. And I think it's valuable in so many ways beyond just looking at the outcomes because it does provide opportunities to make course corrections in the moment of the program. And so, as you think about what's right for your own programs, really consider this one. The other summative evaluation, summative is the evaluation commonly known also as outcomes, where we're looking specifically at the actual outcomes of the program. So is it performing in the way that we thought? Are we seeing that our target audience is actually achieving the desired outcomes, whether it's improved reading scores, whether it's greater leadership competencies, whatever it may be, your outcomes or summative evaluation is what you would use to determine whether or not that's actually happening. And lastly, the Kirkpatrick model of evaluation. This is one that I also appreciate. This is pretty common in training programs. And so, the corporate program that I mentioned earlier, we use the Kirkpatrick model to evaluate that program. And so the Kirkpatrick model includes 4 different levels. Level 1, learner satisfaction, where we're asking the questions, did the learners actually enjoy this program? Was it relevant to their roles? Level 2, learning gains. If we had a specific content area, did participants leave the program having improved their knowledge in whatever set area it may be? At level 3, which this one I will say is can be very difficult, just depending upon the timeline, behavioral change. Did we actually see a marked improvement or change in how people were acting and behaving in whatever context? And I will say that that's one where, as we talk about timeline and trade-offs and the like, it can be difficult to adequately measure behavioral change if you don't have a long enough runway to do so. In the case of the leadership program that I mentioned earlier, what we did was we knew that just by virtue of the contract and agreement that we were going to have several years to go back to participants and see and find other ways to engage them around behavioral change. We used pre and post self-assessments to see if participants were able to demonstrate the ways in which they were starting to integrate some of the specific leadership skills in their day-to-day work. And of course, there's limitations, of course, for self-assessments for sure. But it was a reasonable solution for us given the limited time frame that we had. And then lastly, level 4, and this one is another one that is difficult and that requires a much longer time frame. Did we actually see the expected ROI? Did the organization see the ROI that they expected from this investment in this program? And that ROI, of course, will be driven around what were their larger objectives here. Were they hoping to see greater engagement among their employees or workforce in some form or fashion? And so, again, that's not necessarily the sort of thing that you can immediately see right after the completion of a program. That's a cultural change that sometimes will require time. And so, as the resources are available for these sorts of programs, I think you have more opportunity to be able to engage in that level 4 around ROI, organizational impact. So I want to talk about just a few other important considerations, and then we'll shift gears to open it up for Q&A. Beyond those key steps, a couple of things that I think is important to think about. Culturally responsive evaluation. I think this is huge in whatever evaluation you're conducting, because it allows you to have an awareness of just the unique cultures that may be present in whatever form or fashion. And again, this is in whatever context it may be that you are executing your program evaluation. But it's important to really pay attention to a couple of factors. Included among them, where is the evaluation taking place? What are the stories of this community? And that community could be, could be a work environment. It could be, school environment. Could be all sorts of things. Who gets to tell that story? Who gets to be again a part of the planning for this? Have we given an opportunity to ensure that we are considering the voices of others? And what dimensions of diversity are most salient in this community? How is power distributed in different ways? And so, what I like and appreciate about culturally responsive evaluation, whether you've trained in this or not, at the very least, it gives you this moment to take a step back and say, hey, have we considered some of these different dimensions in any form or fashion? And while we may not be formally trained in this area, at least let's talk about what would this entail. What are some things that we should be sensitive to or aware of in different ways? And so, encourage each of you all as you're building your evaluations, think about these different dimensions and all sorts of ways that you can engage. These are just a couple of quick questions on what it means to be culturally responsive. And I won't go run through each of these areas, but I think that as you'll see here, it does offer thoughts on how you take into consideration all sorts of different factors and look through a lens that extends beyond just your purview. And so, again, I think it's the smart thing to do as evaluators to be considerate of that in your process because I think it will help ensure a more meaningful outcome from your evaluations. Another big thing to think about also are the ethical considerations in program evaluation. I'm not going to do a deep dive here, but I do want to at least talk about a couple of areas in which you may be conflicted with all sorts of different challenges in evaluation. At each stage of evaluation, sometimes there are these different moments, right? So at the early stage, when you're just starting to plan, it may be that the design that has been selected is not adequate, and maybe that was intentional. Maybe there's some conflict of interest that emerges from this. Maybe there are some legitimate stakeholders who were not invited to the conversation. And so we're missing that perspective, and we've got this blind spot now. And so you want to be sensitive to thinking about some of the ways in which this might manifest in your work during the design process. So as you're selecting what your methods are and your research design, it may be that there's pressure to say, hey, we only want this sort of design. We don't want to think about any other sort of approaches. And maybe they want one that's not appropriate. They may be producing misleading information in different ways. And so, again, things that you may be confronted with. That last bullet point again is that again, this idea of who gets the opportunity to engage in this process. Have we given enough opportunity for those who might be relevant to offer their thoughts? And so them not getting a chance to look at the design process, those who have a helpful perspective, could also be an ethical dilemma. And just a couple more here. So during data collection, and this is one, that harkens back to my earlier case that I mentioned before with this corporate program is this idea that the data from your participants was compromised. So if there is almost not forced, but this moment where the loss of anonymity or confidentiality is compromised in any way, what do you do in that moment? This last bullet point here is a big one, and I'll be honest, I don't know that I can give you one specific answer on how you address this. But you may find when you're in the field that you find out about some illegal behaviors, some dangerous behaviors, unethical behaviors. What do you do, right? And for those of us, for example, who had to evaluate programs that involve children, what do you do if there's a conversation that's happening with students and you find out that there have been some difficult or just harmful things happening to children? Most often, I think those of us who work in K-12 have a legal mandate called mandated reporting to share that. And I would dare say that as evaluators, while we don't have necessarily that same policy per se, it is important to really think about what do you do in those situations and how you address that. Hopefully you don't. I pray that no one has to deal with that sort of extreme circumstance. But the reality is when we're evaluating, we're in the research field in any capacity, sometimes you will encounter some difficult experiences. And so, at the very least, being prepared in advance and thinking about what are our approaches and strategies to addressing this if for some reason this emerges is important for you all as evaluators. Last one is data analysis. This one also is interesting. It's like the reporting feature as well. Sometimes you'll find that different stakeholders will say, "Hey, cut out half of this portion of the. Don't share the bad stuff. Only include the good stuff, right?" And so, again, as an evaluator, you're going to have to, in an ethical way, find the right manner in which to suggest that, well, I think we absolutely need to still include that, right? Or maybe if it isn't included in the publicly produced report, we still want to make sure that you all are thoughtfully considering that this was a big issue for the program. And so I hope that you're going to put in measures to fix those things. And so nonetheless, I hate to end on a doom and gloom kind of moment, but those are the big things that I would suggest that you all as evaluators just be mindful of. And so, as I promised at the beginning of this, said I would be remiss as an evaluator if I did not take a moment to expect you all to come back and evaluate this experience. And hopefully, you were able to, in this session, gather new knowledge. So, give me a moment while I quickly launch the poll again, just to see if we've seen any change or movement in how you all rate your knowledge of this particular area. And hopefully, this will work. Um, Hopefully, it will allow me to. Okay, here we go again. I've opened up the poll. Okay, I'm going to close out the poll now. I think I have the vast majority have participated. All right. Looks like the needle has moved a bit. I see, a few more are feeling a little bit more knowledgeable of this topic, which is wonderful. I certainly hope that, as you desire to learn more, you might think about engaging with our larger certificate program in this area. But this is wonderful to see that you all are feeling much more knowledgeable of this topic. And so it's been a delight, and I look forward to hearing and engaging with you all if you have questions.
All right. Thank you. So I want to give a big thank you first to thank you so much for the presentation and the interactables and things like that. So really, I think we all really appreciate it here. So as we get to the Q&A portion of our event today, I would encourage everyone to start, if you have any questions, comments, things like that, as they are starting to come in already. Great. Put them in the chat feature down here, and we will go through them and get our expert here to go over them. But in the meantime, because we got to pay the bills, I want to quickly share with everyone this certificate. Here we go. It's the Certificate in Education Program Evaluation. So these are professional certificates that are done, and this one in particular is a 7-week program. And so I encourage you, if you registered, you'll get a link to this as well. But to take a look through this, Dr. Hodge-Clark is one of the three instructors for this. So if you liked what you saw today and it was helpful, you're going to get so much more within that. And it starts February 22nd for this one. So now that we've gone through that part of it, let's open it up to question and answer. So here we go. Um, I'm just taking a look through them now. Oh, some great feedback. Some great feedback. Thank you, everyone here. So, the first thing here, this was from earlier in the presentation from Colleen. I'd love to hear a story about what is meant by the tunnel vision warning. Do you recall that?
Yes, yes. So I think, at least in my experience, right, especially when you're operating with a long serving existing program, people are like, hey, we've been great at this in this way. There's no need to ruffle feathers and change things, right? And so there's sometimes a bit of resistance to seeing all of what may be transpiring in a program against those blind spots in different ways. And so I would say for me, just specific experiences, again, just thinking about, in particular, even in my current role, sometimes as I lead academic program reviews, all sorts of ways in which a storied program is great, but it's like, hey, I heard about this from a particular student. And so maybe there's an opportunity for us to dig further in the ways in which we can enhance this program beyond the traditional ways in which we've been executing it for the last decade or more. So that's frankly, it's a little cheeky, but the idea is that don't assume going into it what you know are the outcomes of the program. Allow yourself as the evaluator, particularly if you're connected to the program, to open up and see all sorts of other areas that may not be as immediately obvious.
Okay, excellent. All right, you ready for the next one?
Yep,
So
go for
this
it.
question from Sadia, I hope I pronounced that correctly. How would you recommend encouraging slash motivating more responses? We often struggle getting responses from people even when we keep the questions short and focused.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll be honest. I think that's always going to be a challenge, whether you're an evaluator, researcher, or otherwise. I will say a couple of things that have been effective for me I mean, one big one that a lot of people use are incentives to encourage people to participate in a survey, for example. And so offering a small, maybe a small gift certificate for participation in different ways is always useful if you have the budget and the resources. One other interesting experience I've had, and this dates back years ago, and I see one of my former colleagues on the line here. We had a big survey that we would have to execute with the organization I previously a part of. And of course, nowadays everyone, executes things online. No one is thinking about a paper-based survey in any form or fashion. However, we realized that I think because it was a pretty lengthy survey, we decided let's go ahead and send these surveys in paper format to a couple of again these key players we need to complete this, and we included these self-addressed stamped envelopes so they didn't have to use any of their own money or resources. And surprisingly, we saw a fairly decent number come back to us in paper form. And while I know that again may be antiquated, I wouldn't rule that out as an option because especially if it's again an online survey, survey fatigue is real, and we are all inundated with thousands of emails in a given day. And so, finding other former traditional ways to engage may be one such opportunity to see much more response and engagement. But great question. Sorry, I wish I had like the secret sauce to that. And if others have examples that they've found to be successful, I mentioned before, I love for this to be a reciprocal learning environment. So please feel free to include them in the chat.
Great. All right, so our next one here, AJ wants to know, well, first, thank you. So great. Uh, could you discuss the process of communicating the evaluation results to different stakeholders?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the areas I didn't dig into today is that reporting feature. And, for me, I've found that a couple of different formats work. Typically for my internal audience, it may be the much more longer extended report that really digs into the weeds. But when I'm thinking about, be it an external funder or some other entity, I normally will create a really nice executive summary. that includes great graphics. And, infographics are not as big as they used to be, but I think that those are also still valuable at communicating, um, you know, what's happening with the particular program or the outcomes. And so those are the biggest ways where I make distinctions among my stakeholders. Is frankly, it's in the size and detail of how much I share, and not with any intention of hiding anything, but just knowing that certain external groups just want those sound bites to understand whether or not this program was effective or not. And the internal team, who will likely be making changes and decisions based on this report, need that much more robust, detailed, in-depth content.
All right, our next question from uh, Lidwin, again, I hope I got that right, wants to know, and this is an interesting question, and how far is storytelling a method that can be used in evaluation?
That's a great question. I think absolutely. I have not used it in my experience, but I will say that it presents itself as a wonderful method to be able to share the outcomes of a program. There are different, I will say, sorts of narrative analysis, for example, in evaluation that can be used that I think is very synergistic with this idea of storytelling and using images to really share what's happening with a particular program. I think for sure, nowadays people want to be connected and really understand at a different level beyond just your traditional script on paper. And so I highly encourage you to think about, hey, can we use this as an approach? Now, the one caveat is this. That's the sort of question that you also want to ask of your stakeholders early on in the needs assessment, right? Because if they have an expectation of a very traditional technical report, then you may not decide to take that approach with the larger storytelling sort of method and presenting the information if that's not what they want. But if you can, convince them that this will give you this really robust narrative of what we've learned from the program early on, then hopefully you can convince them of such. But definitely, just think about it at that needs assessment phase and make sure everyone's on the same page with the idea of using that as a tactic and telling the story of the program. But great question.
Yeah. Okay, so going to try to get these last few in here. So Ryan, this is a comment and then question at the end. Ryan says, I appreciate you flagging that when most people think of evaluation, they think of summative or impact assessment. This makes it a bit more challenging to do a process assessment, for example, particularly when engaging with interest stakeholders that don't necessarily have an evaluation mindset. I feel this is further exacerbated by the lack of quality measures for the process. So then the question is, can you offer any insight into these challenges?
Thank you for that. And I'm just reading, I see it in the chat because I want to make sure I fully understand the
Hmm.
question here. Um, yeah, so I think, Ryan, if I'm understanding your question correctly, because most folks are most interested in just the outcomes, we don't care whether or not it was executed well or not. It's hard to make the case for why we should look at the process. I'll say this anecdotally. If we're not thinking about process and how it's impacting the outcomes, then in some ways, I think we're being completely short-sighted. And the reality is that the process may dictate how well or not the program performs. So I mentioned the example again earlier about, if we say that we're going to have these sorts of computer labs available for our students, and that's going to be a big part in their improvement in their learning, if we've only got one or two working computers, then no wonder the scores were low, right? And I think if you can give them examples of the ways in which you are not looking at your process may actually be the factor that's driving the outcomes more than the actual substance of the content that you're sharing with that community. I think that'll go a long way in making the case for why you all should also consider process or formative evaluation in your planning. Hopefully that answered the question, but I think it is an important kind of conundrum that is pretty common because most folks are most interested in just looking at the outcomes and not the process. But my recommendation, if you have the time and resources, is to always do both.
Okay. So Kara wants to know, is the certificate for education program evaluation for education programs only. Carol works in community conservation. Would the certificate be relevant for evaluating nonprofits and can?
That's a great question, and I'll say, and I see my other colleague here, Dr. Levine, on the line, so feel free to jump into. We have students from all different sectors and organizations that come to our program, be it public health, or I think I've had a few in environment. I've had several from the NSF, the Natural Science Foundation. And so while the program includes education in the title, I think that what you learn and the skills and understanding of evaluation are germane to so many different sectors. And so I would say absolutely, what you learn will be valuable, whether it's in education or not.
Okay, great. So, all right, we're going to rapid fire these now because we're approaching our time. So Nancy wants to know, how do you evaluate the quality of the data from your survey to avoid biases, blind spots, et cetera? And do you have any suggestions on how to convert this feedback into meaningful, actionable items to improve a program?
So with survey data, several things I try to do, and I think I saw someone ask a question about surveys too and piloting. In almost every circumstance, I'm going to administer or do a pilot survey. And part of the reasons why, or pilot testing in different ways, is so that one, I can ensure that are the questions structured correctly? Are the responses that we're getting to this aligned with what we were intending? One of the other things that you can do, which is also common practice, are what we call, and forgive me, the term is escaping me, but basically it's interviews. As people are completing the survey, you say, okay, read the question, talk me through how you're interpreting the question and your response. And so as you do that, that's when those moments when you realize, oh wow, the jargon we use is so confusing that I'm getting multiple different interpretations of this. And that's when you go back and make corrections. And so I think on the front end, that's one of the ways that I try to make sure my surveys are well designed so that the data that's produced, I can be way more confident in the integrity of that data.
All right, so we are at our time boundary now. So unfortunately, there was a couple more questions. So what I would suggest for anyone, you're going to get follow up on here, and um, we can pass these questions along and get the answers to them. Is that okay with you, Dr. Hodge Clark?
Absolutely, absolutely. And please feel free to share my email address also. I think I shared it
Okay.
with others.
So
So
yeah, so we will include all of this because we want to get to everyone's questions and answers and things like that. So, but that being said, we are at our time boundary, and I think this today was a great session. Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for
thank you
attending
all.
here.
Great
So,
questions. Thank you all.
mhm. So thank you again for Knowledge at Noon. Thank you, and we'll see you all at the next one. Bye, everybody.
Take care, y'all.